Right, now my wife and I visited Cyprus a little while back, and here's a photograph I took at the time of a typical little back street in a Cypriot village. Now with the camera I've tried to compose it in a way that minimises the amount of things I would have to change in the picture. I'd certainly leave these telegraph poles out and telegraph wires because they're fairly ugly and do nothing for the composition. But we'll look at composition, and particularly using photographs in composition elsewhere in this DVD. Right, but just for a moment, let's say that I'm perfectly happy with this composition and I want to get this as a drawing cleanly onto my watercolour paper without having to do all sorts of guidelines. And it's a system called scaling, and the beauty of this means that you can reduce the size of the drawing against the photograph or the reference material you're using, or indeed you can expand the size. It's up to you. Now for the first thing, what I've done is taken a piece of tracing paper and I've done a simple outline sketch of the main features of the picture using a felt tip pen. So that gives me a somewhat simplified sketch compared to the photograph. Having said that, the sketch itself is still quite complex and would be quite difficult for me to copy just by looking at it and trying to replicate everything in the right place, and certainly at a different size on my watercolour paper. So let's see how we overcome that problem. Right, what I've got here is our old friend the sheet of acetate. This time I've drawn a grid of 2-inch squares, and you can see I've done a line of 4 squares upwards. Well, this one isn't 2 inches, but it doesn't matter because most of this area is the sky anyway. But across we've done 5 squares of 2 inches, so the actual picture size is approximately 7 inches that way and 10 inches that way. Now by dividing this picture into these squares, these 2-inch squares, what I can now concentrate on when I come to draw the picture is to simply draw any line that appears within a particular square in the same position in that square on my paper, and this is how I'm going to go about it. Now you can see that this drawing is actually quite a bit smaller than the main picture here. Let's take square B2 for example, this one. You can see here that the right hand side of the door runs almost centrally down that square in the way that I've drawn it here, and then drops just a little bit below into square B1 as I've drawn here. The top of it rises a little bit into square B3, so I've taken that up there and then carried on like that. And what I've done with all of these lines in each of these squares is simply to replicate what's in each of these squares in the same position. And you don't have to be too deadly accurate about this. So for example, this line here is about 1/3 of the way in from the right hand side of square B3, so I've put that line in about 1/3 of the way in from this smaller square here. And what I'm going to do now is to work my way through each square bit by bit, and I'll find that if I do it correctly I'll get a completely accurate but scaled down picture of what I have here. Right, let's have a look at the rest of these lines in square B3. We have the lintel over the door which rises like that. So there's also another little line there which is the door frame, I think, and then we have a little bit of the, I don't know what that is, stonework or something, and that curious D-shaped shape, which I don't know whether that's a light or just a stone sticking out or what, but it doesn't matter. And then we have the tops of 2 what I think are windows just about here, like that. Now the beauty of this is that if I wanted to expand the picture and do a much bigger version, all I'd have to do is to draw a grid of say 3 or 4 inch squares and then draw these lines in the same areas in those bigger squares, and that would automatically enlarge the picture in the same way that this has automatically been reduced. There, just overlapping 2 squares like that and disappearing behind the hedge. Now you can see that we've got an accurate reproduction a quarter the size. It's a quarter the size incidentally because it's half size width-wise and half size depth-wise, so that ends up as a quarter the size overall. Now if I'm honest, if I was scaling something down to this sort of relatively small size for painting, I certainly wouldn't be drawing grid lines on the watercolour paper. What I'd be more inclined to do was to use this drawing here, this smaller drawing, as an intermediary stage and then trace this down onto the watercolour paper using the trace down material or scribbling on the back with the pencil, as I showed you before. I know it adds another stage into the process, but it will ensure that you will get a clean and accurate copy, reduced in size in this case, or if you wanted to, you can go the other way as I've explained and expand it as big as you want. But using this scaling system in combination with the trace down paper does mean that you've got a very simple and accurate way of reproducing a working drawing onto your watercolour paper in the right size without fear of the watercolour paper itself being smudged or damaged before you start to put paint on it.